Hello, my name's Gavin, this is Genre Books, and today I'm going to be talking about a pulp magazine that ran for a number of years in the 30s and the 40s as part of my contribution towards March Mystery Madness. For March Mystery Madness, I have mostly been concentrating on Miss Marple. This is genteel. This is mannered. This has set rules and a little bit of decorum, even when they're killing each other. These rules do not apply with spicy detective stories. The particular issue I read was from December 1941, which is Volume 16, Issue 2. The title started in 1934 and was to continue for a few years after the issue I read, even though I think about a year later it does change its name. So for 9 years it was Spicy Detective. But in the repressive regime of the land of the free, the name was changed. Not forced to be changed, but if they wanted to keep in business, they'd better change it to Speed Detective. To get rid of the word spicy, to throw the prurient hounds off the scent. This magazine was published by Culture Publications, a firm who had changed its name to Culture Publications to again avoid the continued interest from the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. The publisher was Harry Donenfeld. He had helped to start a printing company some 2 decades after emigration from Romania to the United States. And they printed leaflets, pamphlets, etc., but moved into printing magazines, firstly for others and then off their own back. One of their first publications was called The Racing Tab. This was a horse racing form. The vast majority of the gambling in New York at this time was controlled by a cartel of 3 mobsters who must be fairly famous because I'd heard of at least one of them. Frank Costello, Arnold Rothstein, and Lucky Luciano. Frank Costello became a friend of Donenfeld, and it ended up being a lifelong friendship. But with this particular publication, you've got to think that there is at least consent, if not complicity, here in the publication of something printing racing tips in a world where all the gambling is controlled by only a few people. But Donenfeld diversifies away from the gambling and also prints, although he is not the registered publisher, for Artists and Models magazine, which purportedly was showing people about painting techniques and was also an excuse to get some nude photography into print. As a publisher himself, he starts with Juicy Tales, Joy Stories, and Hot Tales, which are a mix of photography, again, and illustrations, including from one Adolph Barrow. More of him later. Editor for these titles was Merle Williams Hershey, who was the ex-wife of the editor of William Clayton's pulp magazines. So it's a fairly close-knit publication world in New York. In the late 20s, there's the stock market crash, the beginning of the Great Depression, and this led to companies going bankrupt and new companies starting up. And Donenfeld suffers from this and also takes advantage of this. The new Donenfeld magazine publishing company, Merwill Publishers, Elmo Press, Tilson Publications, all various iterations of his publishing empire, and also things where debts could be stored, companies declare bankrupt, and a fresh page starting again, possibly with someone else fronting the company. Then, in 1933, a new company, Super Publications, and the move into pulps that we would recognise as pulp, beginning with Super Detective, but also Super Western, Super Adventure, Super Love. At some point thereafter, the titles of these magazines change from Super to Spicy. So we have Spicy Detective and Spicy Detective Stories. Super Publications becomes Culture Publications, but they continue to print these titles as Spicy. In 1937, Donenfeld gets the contract for the Lone Ranger magazine, which after the success of the radio show became very much a money spinner for him. Later that year, along with the National Allied newspaper syndicate, he takes control of the Nicholson Publishing Company and gets his hands on what is to become the meal ticket for the rest of his career, which is Superman. Other people will do a much better job talking about Superman and the birth of the superhero publishing dominance that was to come. Let's just talk about Spicy Detective Stories. The cover story for the issue I read was The DA's Daughter by Wallace Caton. And it's a tale of corruption in high office and a down-at-heel detective and a lady who spends a good part of the story half-dressed. It has murder, it has double-crossing, it has some gunplay and some fistfights. And this really is the pattern for all the stories to come. Although it's not the cover story, the main story here is a novella from Robert Leslie Bellamy called Crimson Comedy. This is one of the Dan Turner novellas or novelettes, and Dan Turner, Hollywood Detective, is a name I had heard of. I read it in some other book I was reading about pulps. So he is Robert Leslie Bellamy's most famous creation and known in a wider circle than perhaps the readers of Spicy Detective Stories. Robert Leslie Bellamy had previously been a reporter in Los Angeles, and a sort of Hollywood reporter. He'd also been a radio announcer and a film extra, but he turned to writing and found a fair amount of success there. He wrote for all of the Spicy stable, I think. So as well as Spicy Detective, he wrote for Spicy Adventure, Spicy Western, and Spicy Mystery, which was a fairly unique sort of weird, spicy weird magazine. Dan Turner was his most famous creation, as I've said, and after the demise of Spicy Detective Stories, he runs Hollywood Detective magazine himself, which continues into publication until 1950. In the end, he wrote 3,000 stories over a 30-year pulp career. And after the pulp era, success continued as he moved into television. Perhaps the Donenfeld connection was still helping him here, because two of the shows he wrote for were The Lone Ranger and The Adventures of Superman. He also wrote for Perry Mason, 77 Sunset Strip, and others. The Dan Turner novella / novelette was the highlight of this issue for me. It's very slang heavy, and at times I was struggling to keep up with what he's actually saying. I'll give you a quick paragraph just to give you a flavour of the style here. I won't do the accent. I pack 190 pounds of solid heft in my 6 foot plus, and I poured every ounce of it into that roundhouse wallop. Felt the satisfying jolt of it travelling up my arm. It was like smacking a ripe cantaloupe with an axe. The masked guy's noggin rocked back and a blurt of ketchup spewed from his ruined kisser. He folded over, dripping teeth. As well as the fruity language, this is actually just a really good story. There is double cross, there is a femme fatale, there is misdirection, and we have Dan Turner, the Hollywood detective, trying to keep one step ahead of both the cops and the actual criminals as well. So yeah, definitely the highlight of the magazine for me. Then we have a comic strip halfway through the magazine, and I told you Adolf Barrow would be a name to return, and this is Sally the Sleuth from Adolf Barrow. Beginning with the first issues of Spicy Detective Stories, she begins in 1934 and is therefore one of the earliest comic book heroines that we have. She predates Batman and Superman and all of those guys. It's difficult to say she's a trailblazer for strong, independent women because she ends up tied up quite a lot, and there are, as you might imagine, in something called Spicy Detective Stories, some bondage overtones here. This element and her depiction can make you feel, a little bit queasy as a modern reader, and probably queasier still when you realise this was the product of your grandparents' or great-grandparents' generation. The next story was Homicide is Hard to Hide by James A. Lawson. I found it a bit difficult to place this story. It seems to be both a detective and a western at the same time, and the dress described by people seemed to place it in an era before some of the technology in the story that was used. There's still the usual fare of missing funds and suspicious deaths and double crossing. There's a widow who isn't grieving as much as you'd think a widow would be grieving, and you have both a male and a female detective coming to the case from different angles. James A. Lawson did write for this stable of magazines, and unsurprisingly did a lot of western and some romance. So this Spicy Detective Story seems to be a little bit of a mix of all of these genres. Dead Man's Game by Stan Warner is an oddity. It seems to be a variation on the locked room kind of mystery, of guy with no arms kind of mystery. It's not really a believable tale, but it's quite a fun, short little read. In brief, it tells the story of Jake and Red Hamaker, who work the oil fields. Red Hamaker has lost both his arms in a oil drilling accident somehow, and what had begun as amazing fraternal love over the years since the accident has turned into bitter resentment on both sides. Things in this story escalate quickly and nastily. The remainder of the stories in this magazine progress very formulaically, more formulaically than other pulp magazines I have read. Variations on the themes, but the themes seem to still be there in every single story. Straight from the Feed Box by Bob Leeson. So again, we have competing detectives. Again, there's a double cross, and there is just wanton violence everywhere. There are the usual slew of advertisements, some sleazier than normal. No Charles Atlas this time round, but the Rosicrucians are there, so I felt somewhat at home once I'd seen that. No letters page. Something I have noticed with the spicier side of things is that not only do the authors of the stories hide behind pseudonyms quite a lot, but no one really wants to be associated with the letters. There are no fan clubs and addresses printed turning up here, as you find with some of the science fiction pulps. Nor is spicy detective stories as spicy as it might lead you to believe. I did a Spicy Pulp review back last August for Garb August, and again, whilst the stories aren't all that spicy, it did include some photography, which I think elevates it into that spicy realm, and that is not present here. You have some drawings. They are mostly suggestive rather than explicit. Far more problematic, I think, for modern readers is the democracy of the violence, shall we say. You expect the violence between gangsters, between detectives and gangsters, but you have some uncomfortable moments where, you know, a woman is slapped or punched, and whilst they are mostly saved in time, the more uncomfortable power dynamics are on display here, and accentuated by some of the pictures as well. And I'm not entirely sure what I think about that. I mean, we are left in no doubt in these stories that this behaviour is abhorrent, and yet it can linger a little bit too much on that behaviour. Perhaps I'm overthinking it. Perhaps we should be almost applauding these writers for writing about it rather than sweeping it under the carpet like successive generations have done. I think perhaps there is a bit of a choice where they are found wanting on some occasions between highlighting something and calling it out as bad and lingering anyway. And maybe on this point I feel I'm siding more with the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, or whatever they're called. Anyway, that aspect leaves a bit of a bad taste in the mouth of the modern reader. Maybe this is why some of these stories are best left forgotten. But the best of the stories in here, I think, deserve a little bit of a renaissance. I'll certainly be reading some more Robert Leslie Bellum in future years and booktube events. But there we have it. Spicy detective stories, one of the stepping stones in the pathway from racing tips and erotic photography to the continued comic legacy of the Man of Steel. And I may get my chance with Bellum earlier than I think, depending on which spicy pulps I might read during the rest of the year. If I can find one of his contributions to Spicy Adventure, there is Spring into Adventure coming up. For the mystery weird, we have Horror Mayhem, so Spicy Mystery might be a way in there. And definitely Spicy Western for June on the Range. I do love discovering these pulp magazines, even when some of the stuff you might find in them you're not the greatest fan of. But until next time, bye.